So, when I was a student here at Wesleyan, I published over 1,000 pieces of content. Today, I will not be telling you how to publish 1,000 pieces of content, nor will I really be going into how to increase your work output or do more words per minute with your articles. All of that stuff is not really what today is about. Instead, I'm going to be discussing a problem I noticed that stopped people from writing. And the great news is, even if you aren't a writer or you're not going into a creative field, it's still incredibly applicable to you. So, back to the 1,000 pieces of content. I think it's pretty cool if anyone does anything 1,000 times. In my case, though, I think it was pretty miraculous that I, in fact, became a writer and then was able to write so much. This is due to a couple of key things. One, no one in my family is a journalist, no one is any sort of media titan, and no one is any sort of professional writer. Second, when I was a sophomore in high school, my English teacher told me I was a terrible writer. And yes, she did use the word terrible. Third, and related to that, from a young age, when I was a kid, all the way up to early college years, I was never considered a writer, a creative, a journalist. If you had asked anyone who of my peers was that, I was definitely not on that list. And what I found really interesting once I actually got into the world of writing is many of my writer friends who were professional writers, so they were successful in the field, or at least making a living off of it, had a very similar story to me. And on the flip side, what I found really fascinating was a lot of people who had been told early on that they were incredibly gifted, they were innately talented at writing, they either got spooked and didn't end up becoming professional writers or flamed out incredibly quickly. So the question obviously for me became, why was that happening? First and foremost, I decided to go around asking people I was talking to. Obviously, in discussing with them, my 1,000 pieces of content stat would come up, and I would get the same response. I could never do that. Obviously, I would then ask, well, why could you never do that? And I would get the same smattering of very interesting responses. People's fears are always the same. It's that they say they have no talent. And again, what is talent? That's a very subjective thing. Two, people say I could never write anything good in a shorter period of time. And again, it's not just writing anything, it's writing anything good. Number three, people are afraid they won't be able to think of good ideas in a short period of time. Chief among these, number four, I'm sure everyone has a fear of this, it's that people will tell you that your work is bad. Related to that is number five, which is that not only is your work bad, but it's so bad that no one wants anything to do with you. And then lastly, there's a real fear of commitment in the sense that once you create a product with your name attached, you are forever welded to that product. So in the case of writing, if you have a bad byline, you're forever going to have your byline attached to that article that you created. But what I found really fascinating was none of these things have to do with writing 1,000 articles. These are actually fears everyone has when they write one article and when they try to do one thing. So, okay, how do we get people over these fears? There's a lot of research out there in terms of how to get good at stuff. Most popular, I would say, you've probably heard of Malcolm Gladwell's kind of idea of putting 10,000 hours of work in to get pretty good at something, or at least pretty decent at it. This was a common theme of his book Outliers, where he kind of charted the tales of many people who did just that. Ironically, the researchers who created the studies through which Malcolm Gladwell wrote his book said that he misinterpreted their data, awkward, and then said it wasn't necessarily about the arbitrary number of hours, but instead about the amount of time you spend deliberately practicing something in order to master a skill. There's lots of other people out there with plenty of different productivity advice, but they will not give it to you unless you give them $500 a minute, and it's not very good. So what I also found most interesting was, on top of all of this, the big problem was none of these answers about practicing, about deliberate practice, skill mastery, none of them also really got into what it takes for someone to want to practice anything for 10,000 hours, or makes them want to even just begin acquiring a skill, let alone mastering it. And if you go into any of these websites or talk to any of these people, they'll say something really vague about driven individuals. It gets really meta about motivation. In reality, I can sum up what you need to do or what you don't need to do in exactly 6 words. And this comes from an editor of mine who put it best, which is you need to stop treating your work as precious. Or, to put it in slightly more honest and pessimistic terms, you need to accept that your work is going to be bad for a long time. Again, awkward. You'll have to spend a lot of time making it less bad, and then hopefully and eventually it will become good, theoretically. So I know this is not particularly the inspiring advice you thought you were going to get, but learning how not to hold on to anything you're creating as a very delicate china doll is in fact the most liberating thing you can do when trying to acquire or master a skill. So you might be wondering, what do I mean as precious? I turned to the very trusty Merriam-Webster dictionary. Told me that it is something that is of great value or high price. It is something that is highly esteemed or cherished, and of course something that is excessively refined. Now, when I started writing as an 18-year-old freshman at Wesleyan, my work definitely was not of high value or great price. It was most definitely not highly esteemed or cherished, and it is laughable to assume that it was excessively refined. Some of you might be saying, okay, but there's that good quote about how, people are their own worst critics. Maybe I'm misremembering this. Maybe I was always kind of a good writer to begin with, and my English teacher from my sophomore year of high school was completely wrong. To that I would say, oh no, it really was that bad. So for the purposes of putting together this talk, I actually dug through 6 years back in my inbox, and I found the very first article I ever wrote for a real kind of non-Wesleyan website. This was a real professional website, and this was the feedback I got from an editor, and this was directly copied and pasted from that feedback document. And she wrote, "This needs a ton of work. I felt like you completely made most of this up, and as a result, it mostly missed the mark. And my favorite is the last sentence. I stopped editing after the first section because it was so off base." Yeah, it really was that bad. Not gonna lie, I was actually in the midst of a tech rehearsal for a play when I got this email with this feedback, and I proceeded to sob on the phone with my mother for 2 hours in the sound and lighting booth in the second stage theater. Again, really bad. The big thing here is when you put a product out there, and regardless of if you think you're a brilliant writer who's gonna get great feedback, or you're like me, and you were expecting something bad, but maybe not as bad as this, it's interesting because you're watching your work be potentially seen as terrible. Again, what happened? You could be, see the validation of yourself being thought of as a fraud, or you might see your imposter syndrome go through the roof. Someone could tell you the jig is up, or, for a lot of people who are really, really great at writing, you might be told that your work is in fact not above modification or criticism, and that is really hard for everyone. And so what I've learned as a writer and also as an editor over this lengthy period of time is that's the point at which a lot of people jump ship as soon as they're told that it's going to need a lot of work or that it really is that bad. And in my case, the worst did in fact happen to me. And what I think made the difference looking back on it now is, again, going back to why it's interesting that I'm even a writer, I never thought of my work as sacred or important or of great value or so cherishable. And so I wasn't necessarily surprised per se when I got this piece of feedback. And because I've always thought of my writing as work, and again, not as precious, I was pretty okay with the idea that I would have to keep working really hard at it. So, of course, I'm sitting there with this article that has been ripped to shreds, but only the first 3 paragraphs are ripped to shreds because this woman could not go further. And I kind of had a choice there. A lot of people, again, at that point will quit. As an editor, I have seen people do that quite frequently. Instead, my thought was, well, it couldn't get any worse than this. Again, she didn't edit past the first 3 paragraphs. And I said, why not do another piece? Because they have not fired me yet. And they did not end up firing me ever, but at the time it was yet. And so My goal, though, for that second piece was not to try and, again, create this amazingly perfect article to put that pressure on myself. To me, obviously, I was going to try on it, but it was, let's really aim for this article to not be as bad as this first one. And the good news was, it was really, really bad still, but she was able to edit all the way through it. So that was an improvement. And building on that, the second article, better than the first, the third article, better than the second. And so when I look back on, why was I able to write so much content in college and what did I learn from it? I think the great thing about having to write 4 to 8 articles a week, every week for 4 years is essentially, I didn't have time to dwell on any piece of feedback, whether it was telling me that my work was worthy of some sort of prize or that it was as bad as this first article I created. I just had to sort of read the feedback, think about it, incorporate it, and move on. And in turn, my portfolio grew well past that first article. If I had stopped right then at that one piece being really bad, that would make up my entire portfolio. It would literally be, by statistical standards, 100% of my writing. Instead, because I added 999 more pieces to that work, that one first terrible, awful, no good, very bad article became just 0.001% of my college writing portfolio. And at this point, it's pretty much non-existent. So that's the great thing about putting in that much work. Now, of course, the big caveat here is that you can't just after one bad article and not having an ego about it, suddenly decide that's the end of it. You have to put in a lot more work on top of that. So if I'm being very honest, the first 200 articles I wrote were still pretty bad. The middle 500 were mediocre, maybe a little unmemorable, not totally cringeworthy, nothing worthy of me sobbing in a tech booth for 2 hours, but they were there. Finally, by the next 250, I felt like I was finally getting it together, getting somewhere. And by the end of my senior year at college, I actually had articles that were, I would say, pretty good. Many of them are, in fact, still part of my writing portfolio. Not too shabby, 1,000 articles later. So, if I had to give any advice to someone, it is that it is beyond critical, again, regardless of the skill set, regardless of what you want to do, to get over this idea that your self-worth needs to be tied to any one product, especially when it's your first time trying something. In addition to that, you just don't want to ever get to a point where you pretend that something is not above criticism or that it should never be broken. So in conclusion, for the things you hold most dear, I would say absolutely take a hammer to them, especially when it would be the most painful. Because if you put in the work and the time and you deal with that sort of very, very bad feedback, your work will one day become something worthy of being called cherished, valuable, and of course, precious. Thank you very much.